Working Cows Podcast, episode 321. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. And this episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. Very excited to be joined today by Chuck Schembre. Chuck is a certified soil scientist and also an educator with Understanding Ag, and he has a lot of experience in small to large scale market gardens. And so we're going to talk to him about market gardening, but I think a lot of these will be useful ideas for your own personal garden as well, and how to apply soil health principles to your garden. And I think a lot of times we tend to look at soil health on the macro scale and on the broad acre scale of our own operations, but sometimes don't use those same strategies when it comes to our own personal gardening. So I'm going to talk to him about some of those ways that we apply soil health principles to our gardens. So very excited for this conversation. Chuck, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Clay, thank you so much for having me here. It's definitely an honor, and all the different folks you've had speak, it's truly an honor to be on that list. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's selfishly, it's a conversation I've wanted to have for quite a while, specifically around kind of this regenerative gardening or no-till gardening, and then also I think applying those principles and those practices to broader scale acreages as well. But let's start out there. Start out with kind of some of the way that you approach soil health practices in diversified small scale vegetable versus large scale, or just start with a small scale, I guess. Maybe kind of put it in the context of what some of these people might be listening. A lot of ranchers listening probably have a garden, and probably sometimes we will have soil health principles in our mind, but don't always approach our gardening that way. We just go default back to the till it up, plant it every year kind of a model. So let's start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I recognize, this is the Working Cows Podcast, and it's usually focused on grazing. So we'll see how many people attend this today. But, with me working with Understanding Ag and us having, such an impact with grazing, I think this is a really great, crossover here. So certainly this evolution of soil health and vegetables in the garden is very dynamic and sort of all over the place. And for me, just to go back a little bit, this really began for me maybe in 2005 or 6. And that's when I started working on farms and small vegetable farms. And this is in California. And I really gravitated towards some of the biointensive French biointensive gardening and the true organic farmers, people like Elliot Coleman, sort of that revolution of organic farming hitting the mainstream. And it was really rooted in soil health. And just starting there, the focus was reducing the synthetic inputs, increasing diversity, at least above ground diversity. At the time, we were thinking, how do we maximize rotations and create these companion plantings and these interplantings, and thinking deep about the farm ecology. And I think that these principles still apply to today and all of the soil health work. Also the holistic principles from Alan Savory, and that started trickling into some of the orcharding. Michael Phillips is a holistic orcharder who's now passed away, who is dear to my heart, and his teachings. And the way that, that I approach it is to to continually stay true to the fundamentals of what we teach today with the 6 principles of soil health. And I know it sounds cliche to folks often. Okay, we've got this list of things: minimize disturbance, let's armor the soil, we need diversity, etc. We can get into integrating livestock and the challenges and complexities around that, and maybe why it isn't that challenging. It does seem challenging, but on a small scale, let's say an acre or below, let's start there. It's quite easy to implement the principles of soil health. It really is. We have a lot of room for creativity. The timing doesn't have to be as precise as if you're going to go and, seed corn on 1,000 acres and you're working in a no-till system, and how you terminate that cover. And, we have a lot more tools in our toolbox on the small scale. Now it can get very chaotic. People, I think we need a lot more planning at the small garden scale. If you want a commercial market garden, it's going to require incredible planning and foresight and creativity and trial and error. The benefit that we have is there's room for error because you have the diversity, and you can rely on certain crops to do really well and others maybe not to do as well. Right. So I don't know if you want to dive in. We can dive into some specific practices on the small scale.
Yeah, and I say this probably too often, but one of my favorite recent episodes of the Working Cows podcast is called The Most Profitable Acre, with a guy out of Iowa who's doing small scale vegetable farming, but his profit per acre, there'd be very few, if any, livestock operations that could touch him as far as profit per acre is concerned. So I think that there's whether it's stacking fiefdoms and allowing somebody else to do some vegetable gardening on land that you have, or you want something else to do on your own land. If you're doing some direct marketing already, take some vegetables along with you in season. I think there's opportunities for this to be more than just, we're going to can some tomatoes, or we're going to have some potatoes in the cellar or whatever for people, but it can be that as well. So I think it applies to this audience in multiple different ways, and people can apply it to their context in multiple different ways. So I think we can go any direction you want, but the specific practices would be great.
Yeah, and that's a good fun topic to talk about is, stacking enterprises, folks who are interested, who have a lot of acreage, and say, hey, we got an acre over here or a couple acres. How do we approach it? I'll just start there because we do get a lot of clients that at Understanding Ag who are interested in this. They're very interested in the true regenerative lifestyle, where they're going to have a lot of food for the family, and they believe in healthy food. They want to grow nutrient dense food, and they want to find ways to market that and stack some enterprises. So when someone take the regenerative and soil health piece out of the discussion for a moment, because what's important is there's a big learning curve on growing food for folks who haven't done much of it. Even folks who've been gardening for a long time, they really haven't had to put a lot of emphasis in yield, timing, consistency, getting it to the markets. How do you store it? How do you package it? There's so much involved in selling vegetables. So especially direct market. So my first, recommendation to folks is, if you're starting off and you're not jumping all into market gardening as your sole income, you want to stack some enterprises, you really want to start with a few crops, maybe up to 10 if you are that comfortable, but you want to start with low maintenance crops. Things that can store well, things that don't have to go to market very quickly, say like a fresh leafy green or something like that. That's going to require early morning harvest. It's got to be harvested right at the right time. It can't be too mature, too tall, or stemmy, or bitter. It's got to be stored well, and it's got to get to the market quick. And you probably are going to have to clean it and spin it and maybe even bag it up, right? So there's a lot of materials you're going to need for that, a lot of time and foresight. So I like to recommend that people start off with things like butternut squash and something you can store. Potatoes. Potatoes are obviously a bit of a hard nut to crack for the soil health work because you're generally, tilling the soil to plant it. It can be planted no-till, but there's quite a bit of tillage involved in harvesting it. Anything that can be transplanted and wide spaced is usually easier to manage and a bit easier to approach if you're trying to go full no-till. You do want to know where your soil is at before you attempt to just dive in no-till and what equipment and tools you have in your tool belt. So, recommend to people to be very realistic, and you don't want beginning this journey to be stressful. And, I talked to somebody once and they said, well, we've got about 800 acres we run some livestock and we do row crops, and they had some other things going on. And they said, we're trying to do this 1 acre of market garden, and it feels like it takes up 90% of our time. So to start this off, let's be very realistic, understand what is your community interested in? Also, what do you really enjoy to grow? I think that's really important because we often look at vegetables as sort of being grouped into one homogeneous box of crops, but they're all so very different. And interestingly, sometimes the crops that people think they're best at growing is really because of their soil type and their climate, and that vegetable just does really well. And, that can take some time to tease out. So, starting off small and, just trying to jump into a complete no-till program with vegetables without having a strong horticulture experience with those specific crops, because the more you grow a crop, even tomatoes, which is something that everybody loves to grow, there's different timing of pruning, or how much do you prune, and making sure you have good fruit set and which varieties are doing the best, which varieties store well. So, and if you're starting off really just to feed your family, then have fun with it. And don't be afraid of failure, because you really have to fail with vegetables on a small scale. Now, I'm not saying the whole plot would fail, but if a lot of people have a hard time, for an example, with carrots. They take a while to germinate. They need consistent moisture. It's very difficult to do a no-till carrot. So, those are things, start off, be easy on yourself, and continually pick up books and read from people. Go back to the old school people like Elliot Coleman. I've been enjoying his name. It's been coming up a lot more again lately. And if you have an opportunity to go spend some time on, a very intensive, diversified vegetable farm, even if you can go out there and volunteer a little bit, or, I know most people don't have time to intern, but, just getting some exposure to see what people are doing and the infrastructure they have set up in the day-to-day, it's very helpful.
Yeah. Could you talk to me a little bit about resources that you would recommend as far as people determining what their zip code is good at growing? Like, oh, this is going to work here. And I'm not just a genius at growing this. It just works because it's my soil type and my environment. And are there resources that can help get you kind of a leg up in determining that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, every extension has produced, the information. They have their master gardener programs. I think that's a good place to start as like a baseline foundation, get a planting calendar, to know those real specific nuances, like these specific crops and these varieties do really well. Some do better in hoop houses. Some climates, it's better to grow, say, tomatoes in a hoop house through the summer because of, like in Kentucky and those areas, because of the high humidity, or some areas in the colder climates. So you have to talk to local growers. You have to talk to local gardeners, to be honest with you. I mean, I know that's tough because you got to go seek out and find those people, but that's really where you're going to nail down some real specific wisdom and local heritage knowledge of heritage of that area. But, you know, and I caution people that these planting calendars that you're going to find in every state, they're pretty generic. But use them and play around with the timing. And the big thing that's going to be a challenge is the shoulders of the season. So that will take people longer. So, you know, when getting going, you know, it might be another pro tip is to maybe not push it in the shoulder. Everyone wants to. I'm obsessed with it. All of us gardeners are obsessed with really pushing the shoulder seasons and seeing what we can get. But when you're starting off, you can take that that potential failure out of the equation, and you know, maybe say if you're planting summer crops, do it when you really know you're past that last frost date, and you're going to have success.
Sure. Yeah. And
there's a lot of stuff out there on YouTube. It's overwhelming, I'll say. But there is some good content out there, and I'm not here to like advertise other places, but I do really like what the NoTill Growers YouTube channel is doing. I've been involved in this in a long time, and I wish I was, you know, able to produce that kind of content myself for folks, but they are doing a very good job. So if you just need to get some understanding of, you know, managing on a small scale intensively, that's a good place to be, just getting some understanding.
And would the answer on the soil types question be similar? That it's less it's not as easy to give a definitive answer on soil types either, similar to the zip code and climate question?
Yeah, I would say so. There's certainly some fundamentals about certain soil types within a given region, and that's going to give you an idea if you maybe right off the bat need to be thinking about balancing certain minerals in your soil. You know, if you have a really sandy soil that is highly leached and low pH, et cetera, or you have very high clay soils that may be higher in magnesium or things like that. So that's going to give you a good starting point. But if you're building soil health, you really don't need to be concerned about the soil type. And these soil types, the way they're mapped by the NRCS, if you're looking at it through that lens, you know, they were mapped a very long time ago, and some properties have maybe lost more topsoil than others. So where are you starting off at? You know, do you have good soil aggregation? And as you build that soil biology, I really don't think that you need to be as concerned about the specific soil type, but your climate is going to play a big role on, I would say, more than the specific soil type. And I'm a certified soil scientist, and I like to go deep into soil, but really, if you are building optimal soil function, you don't have to worry too much about your soil type.
That's good news.
I know a lot of people might be on the other side of this, pounding their heads against their phone or however they're listening to this podcast right now, who are very into amending soil, and we can talk more about that. But you know, usually the soil biology really starts to correct things for us.
Sure. Yeah. And that's, I mean, basically, so good soil biological function, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but good soil biological function at the end of the day is going to aggregate soil, whether that's sandy soil that is typically very fine, or it's clay soil that's typically, very dense. They're going to meet in the middle with aggregation, right? And you're going to have effective water infiltration in both soils when they're healthy. Is that fair?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, with the clay soils can often be a little bit harder to manage because of their ability to compact and the timing of it, and, you know, of managing the soil if you have tillage involved, or even if you have no till involved. And depending on, you know, are you in a temperate climate where it rains throughout the year, or are you out west where you get no rain during the summer and you're on drip? And, you know, there's a lot of things that come into play in context, but absolutely, when you're building that aggregation and you're improving gas exchange and microhabitat and porosity, and you're improving that water cycle, you know, there's things going on that we've been able to to produce research and science that gives us really good understanding and clues of what's going on. But when we build a strong aggregate, the soil and the plants begin to take care of themselves. They really do. And where there might be a traditional deficiency in that inherent soil type isn't expressed in the crop anymore, because the biology is, playing a role in making these nutrients available and transporting them to the plant. Yeah.
Yep. You mentioned a couple of different species of plants that are difficult to deal with in a no-till system. Are there some that thrive in a no-till system that people could maybe get started with if they were going to go down this?
Yeah, it's all within context of what type of yields you're trying to produce. Of course, because there's large-scale vegetable growers that are trying to tackle complete no-till and say they're not quite achieving the yields, but on a smaller scale, we can get those. And anything that's transplanted that's got a wide spacing, I find works really well. Tomatoes, I've done tomatoes no-till in a variety of ways, and I've had some banger crops with no-till tomatoes. Anything in the Solanaceae family, eggplant, peppers do pretty well. The cucurbit family does really well too. Maybe not cucumbers as much, but the winter squashes, the pumpkins do really well. Any large seeded crop, beans, corn. If you're on a small scale, you can actually transplant corn. I know most people don't think of doing that, but I've actually transplanted sweet corn before, both by hand and with a mechanical transplanter, and was very, very impressed with what was going on with that and the vigor and the yield out of the corn. Let me think here if there's any peas or something that could be no-till. Fava beans, if you're in a climate that can grow favas through the winter, that's a good kill two birds with one stone kind of thing. You're getting some legume kind of cover that you can then harvest later in the winter and early spring. But yeah, I would start there. I probably have missed something in my mind, but large seeded vegetables. So you could try no-till, even pumpkins or anything in the cucurbit family, because it's a larger seed, or you can transplant them. And the same thing with corn too. I mentioned transplanting corn, but obviously we know that corn's grown under no-till conditions.
Sure. Can you kind of walk me through, maybe briefly, I don't necessarily want to take up the rest of our time with this, but kind of walk me through the seasons of a no-till gardener and a soil health gardener. Start with spring and walk through even into the winter, and then maybe we'll talk about some soil amendments after that.
Yeah, so actually, where do you start? It's a continuum, and I'll start here for a commercial market gardener. It starts with great planning and understanding your rotations and even potential tillage rotations and where crops, you do need tillage unless some people are doing the no-till composting method where they're apparently able to direct seed straight into it. But let me start with, it depends what climate you're in, right? Let me go to California as a place that I've market gardened, and you've got a full season, 4-season, and people are 4-season farming in Vermont. So generally, things begin in March. We're going to start in spring. Oh, actually, sorry, it's going to start in January in the greenhouse where you're direct seeding all of your summer crop. If you're in California, you can get tomatoes out late March, early April. Peppers take a long time to germinate, so you're understanding how long things take to grow and get to the right size for transplanting. So you're starting off in January. A lot of greenhouse work. You probably have winter stuff in your hoop houses, which we'll get back to, and around March or so, you're really beginning to think about how you're going to deal with and terminate your cover crops. You should have already been thinking about that. So you're now preparing to do that. A lot of market gardeners aren't growing cover crops, which we should talk about, but I'll keep moving forward. A lot of vegetable growers have used, the green manure. Those who are not doing no-till, they're going to, turn their cover crops over as a green manure or begin tarping is a very popular method, which is a very good method, but it takes a lot of labor and supplies. So, we're getting cool season things in the ground, maybe in some hoop houses, but a lot of people aren't going to allocate their hoop houses for cooler season crops. Maybe they're higher value lettuce, greens, cut leaves, things like that, and make sure they're saving their room for early season transplanting of your summer crops that everyone loves: the tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, probably cucumbers, zucchini, squash. Then once the soil temperatures begin to warm up enough in California, let's say mid-April, we can start direct seeding our root crops: beets, carrots, radishes. Carrots are one of the most popular vegetables. So that's my favorite thing to grow. It's taken a long time, but I really encourage people to truly understand how to farm carrots, because when you're at the farmer's market, they're one of the first things gone. So then, if you're planting outdoors with your summer crop, which everyone will be having some of that going on, depending on their climate, you're getting the tomatoes, you're getting the peppers out there. You begin direct seeding heading into June. You can wait till June to get your pumpkins and winter squashes out there. And throughout the whole summer, to have these high profitable acreage, you're constantly direct seeding and transplanting, but more so, I would say, direct seeding for your succession. So if you want to have carrots and beets and radishes hitting the tables in the restaurants all year, you're direct seeding every 2 weeks, maybe every 3 weeks. And you're understanding that based on the variety, the soil temperatures. There's a lot going on in the market garden that's going through my head right now, but you're constantly moving irrigation and setting up irrigation around small blocks. And maybe you have overhead and you're switching to drip depending on your methods. As you start heading into, let's just skip forward to August. And I know I'm missing a lot in between here, I'm sure, for folks, because sales are hitting. And at some point in a market garden, when you get into about, say, mid-July, August, you're really on full harvest swing. You're probably not transplanting a whole lot, and you're happy not to. It's summertime. It's challenging. Maybe in the cooler climates, the coastal climates, especially in California, you can get away with. In the coastal climates of California, you can almost transplant all year through and not be too worried about heat stress on those transplants. And but around late August, at least for me in my work I've done, is cover cropping and fall planting. In fact, let me back up just a moment. You are direct seeding in the greenhouse, maybe late May, early June, for transplanting in August for your fall crop. So there is summer planting outside. But this is for the fall. And then how do you protect that? And the timing of it is very important. I've even gotten into transplanting at night so that, if you transplant in the early morning where you got the heat and the sun is coming, in a few hours. So I even have done that in the hotter climates so that we can get that summer, get that fall crop growing well. You're definitely hitting your direct seeding hard in August for your fall. You're direct seeding your fall crop, carrots, beets. If you want to have parsnips, those got to be direct seeded in July. They're long season. There's a lot going on. And then, the fall season harvest, even in the winter, it is beginning in mid to late summer. And a lot of people come to me and they start wanting to decide on their fall and winter harvesting in September. And I tell them it's too late. It's way too late, especially in a lot of climates, maybe not in the southern states and probably a lot of areas of California, you can get away with it. So the cover crop planning is a bit of a puzzle that's hard for people to piece together, because you got to have a lot of foresight in what covers your seeding, what space you're allocating to go straight into cover crops, and where you're having your cash crop growing and then what's going to go into that cash crop when that's harvested out. Is it going to be bare in the winter? Can you interseed or interplant to fill that void, to have that armor once you're done harvesting? This is where the creativity comes in, the timing. So yeah, but fall, your things are you're starting to relax. Your harvest is much more enjoyable because you don't maybe have to harvest your greens early in the morning, because you got to harvest greens very early in the morning so they're not bitter. And feel free to cut me off here at any time, because I could keep going. But for those who are winter gardening, winter farming, things going to be going into the hoop houses in September, October-ish, you could say. In winter farming, sometimes people think they're harvesting all through the winter. That's not always the case. Often you're just growing a lot of crops through the winter that will then be ready to harvest in late winter, very early spring, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Spinach is a crop you could probably harvest all through the winter. And depending on your knowledge of your skill, I mean, you could be harvesting root crops all through the winter. And in a climate like California, winter farming for me was much more relaxed, but quite busy, because we have year-round farmers markets, and we could fill that table throughout the whole year, pretty much. And maybe there's a little lull in late February. That's where I normally would notice that. But there's opportunity even here where I am in the high desert of northern Nevada. I've been playing around with different timings and pushing carrots all the way through the fall into January and harvesting in snow. So you start understanding, a turnip or a radish is going to begin decomposing. Brassicas don't overwinter all that well. Carrot tops are going to die off when the frost and snow comes, but the carrots actually, because of their density and whatever the I don't know what you would call it, the genetic makeup of this root crop, it can handle basically frozen ground for a certain time. So, there's room to really play around with this and expanding the availability of food.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, that's good for a lot of reasons. Can you talk to me a little bit about the no-till and the cover cropping strategy and how it plays out in the garden? Is it every acre is no-tilled every year? Is every acre anything every year? In your experience, and what's worked well in your understanding?
Yeah, so a lot of my market gardening is kind of a bit bigger than you could say market gardening. I do have that experience for a few years, but it really started off around 13 to 15 acre scale of diversified vegetable production, and then was down to maybe 3, 4 to 5 acres. And I think that you have a bit more opportunity on the larger scale to incorporate these cover crops and have these blocks that you can rotate through. But let's go to the market garden. Say a 1 acre to 1.5 acre seems to be the common size. Most of the no-till market gardeners right now that I'm aware of are really focused on that compost mulching methods. And they're dabbling with the cover crops, and they're tarping them as a way to kill them off or mow them down. And it is really advancing, but what I'm trying to say is integrating cover crops, especially winter cover crops, into the market garden hasn't been happening for a very long time. I have been working with it myself for maybe close to 15 years in some of the work I've done, and I've definitely found there's a lot of challenges to it. Often a lot of my work was rooted in incorporating winter covers. It all began for me with the diversity. Let's get the ground armored. Let's get a living root in the system. And just by doing that with a diverse winter cover, that was your standard plow down, we call it, with some cereal grains, legumes, probably a daikon radish or some kind of brassica in there. It really did wonders through the winter. The water infiltration increased. You'd see less erosion off a property, and it just felt bountiful with these green materials. Green living plants out there. And when that was turned over into the soil as a green manure, and I'm going back, the original, say, organic methods here, we saw great improvements. So, that's not a bad place for someone to start. I know people want to go no-till, and I know that here, Understanding Ag, we're really focused on trying to get people to that point, but that is not a bad place to start if you are starting off with poor soil aggregation and compacted soils. Now, as you progress and start becoming more advanced with it, there's opportunities that really open up. Everything that we know about cover crops applies to the market garden. People sometimes want to hear something very, very profound, and I'll say, well, plant a cereal rye with some vetch and an Austrian pea and throw a daikon radish. Start there and experiment. What equipment do you have? That's the big deal. If you want to roll or crimp, then you can go out and buy a small roller crimper that can be pulled with a ATV, or just mounted on the back of a tractor. A lot of these market gardeners don't have a sit-on tractor. They're running a BCS or walk behind, right? So we really have to understand what equipment they have. But at the least, you need a good mower. You need a flail mower. Even the BCS has a really nice flail mower. So you're going to have opportunity to terminate this cover, and it's important to get a grass species out there into the garden. And I want to elaborate on this because most gardens do not grow many grasses at all. Even a lot of market gardeners don't grow corn because it doesn't maybe yield a whole lot of income per square foot of bed. And then there's a stigma behind corn for whatever, for the reasons. But sweet corn is amazing. So anyone out there, you got to have your sweet corn out there in the garden. But getting
butter and salt and pepper.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I've been harvesting sweet corn before, and it's like you pull one off and you eat it fresh, and all of a sudden you're pulling off the next one, and I'm just rolling through it like some kind of squirrel or something out there, just munching it down. So even just corn fresh is amazing. But a cool season grass is powerful. And it achieves all of our soil health principles, and it sets us up too for grazing small livestock, chickens out in the market garden. And I think that's another powerful tool for the cover crops for the market gardener, because you're getting that livestock impact, even if it's chickens. But the root system of a grass, whether it be, you got to pick the right grass. I mean, you might not want to be doing like an annual ryegrass out in the garden because it can be pretty hard to terminate. It's pretty dense. But if we start with, oats, which don't overwinter in all climates, but, oats, rye, barley, winter wheat, you can work with triticale. They are very efficient at pumping carbon into the soil, as we all know. They have an extensive fibrous root system that builds aggregates, and it's, exuding a plethora of root exudates, which, I know we've had a lot of people on this podcast, and people can go learn more about how soil health is built, right? But it really truly is through that. We call that solar carbon pump. And if you think about a healthy ecosystem in nature, it always has a grass. The best soil health I ever see is usually in a diverse pasture. So a realization I had many years ago was looking out at a farm I was on, and I thought, we don't really ever have grass rotating through these gardens. And so it's very powerful to be working with grasses. And so we've got our winter grasses that we can work with, and it's a great opportunity for the gardener because you can relax, you can allocate some space and rest it. You want to rotate that into your rotation. And I know I'm not getting very specific here, but that's the point, is you got to find these pockets in the rotation, have good planning on where you can fit these cover crops in. You want a grass component, but you do want it to be diverse. Now, the other thing is summer grasses, warm season grasses, which there's a lot of opportunity there as well. If a market gardener sits back and thinks about their farm, there's often time of it's bare. And the last thing you want to do, even if you're no-till, compost, mulching methods or whatnot, I see people they're just pulling their crop out of the bed, and then they're leaving the bed there. It's bare. It's getting hit by the sun. Temperatures are rising. So we always want to be thinking about how do we keep that soil covered at all times. And if you have the opportunity, if you know that you've had a spring crop that's done by, I'm just throwing out hypothetical dates here, say by June 1st, and then you think you're going to go in those beds, or you're planning to go in those beds with garlic, or which would, be planted in October, or some other fall transplanted crop, a brassica, broccoli, cauliflower, etc. But you have a couple months in between that. You could look at coming in with a warm season grass, with the sorghum Sudan, right? And it doesn't have to put on tremendous biomass, but that the C4 grasses are even more efficient, as we understand, at pumping carbon. I was just talking with a colleague about this, that there's some debate about that, but from what I understand, C4 grasses even provide more amino acids and other root exudates, right? So you're getting that diversity of root exudation, which is going to promote other microorganisms that are part of this efficient nutrient cycling, building protozoa, building that aggregate. And now you have an opportunity, if you're in a climate where it doesn't rain a lot in the summer or at all, say like California, you pull the plug on irrigation, you let that sorghum dry up, and you can roll that thing down, or you can mow it. But you can control how big the stalks get. And now you have a mulch. And that's the power of using your grass. So you just pump more carbon into the soil. You're building the aggregate. Now you have a mulch you can work with. So getting creative with these different cover crop strategies in the market garden can be really how someone can take things completely to the next step. And what's the ultimate goal? Well, it needs to be financially advantageous to us, right? But in time, you realize maybe I don't need to fertilize much. If you're bringing chickens and livestock in there to graze off some of that sorghum Sudan or that cool season cover, you're getting manure, you're getting urine. We're building that natural soil fertility and cycling. And I know a lot of the audience has heard all of this, but I think my message is embrace everything that you have heard. There's a reason why there's so many amazing people out there that continue to preach this. And it's hard sometimes for folks to say, well, here's exactly the formula and template you should follow for the market garden, because we all have different personalities and ways of looking at things. So getting the cover crops in the garden can be very paramount. And again, like I said, I think it leads towards having way less inputs and an opportunity for having your more habitat for beneficials and insects and things like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So our livestock integration strategy on our garden, it's a 40-foot by 80-foot garden with 8-foot tall fences around it. And so what we've done is we've thrown our sheep in there, just a few of our sheep in there, and basically bale grazed them through the winter. I don't know if that's a really bad idea, but 2 years ago when a bunch of our neighbors' gardens droughted out or had issues, we did actually get to harvest a crop. So, and then this year we actually had some pest issues and some hail issues, but we're still gonna have some things growing in there. But is that one strategy, or is that a good strategy as far as livestock integration is concerned?
Yeah, folks who are not market gardening as a living and on much bigger acreage pretty much have a one-up ahead of the game. If they're already working with livestock and have sheep and are well experienced with it, then and you're not farming for profit, so you're not worried about the winter. If you're stacking enterprises or you're just trying to have more food for the family, but if you have an acre or two you're dedicating to growing some vegetables for market, you don't have to sweat the winter season, because it does require much more understanding and skill and perseverance and determination to be a winter farmer in general. So take the season off and then think about what I talked about with putting a warm season out there, or even if it's corn, or and you can interseed into corn as well, right? So you can have a whole bunch of forage going into the winter that you could do exactly what you just said. And I think any way we can get livestock into the system is beneficial. Because if you're going to use livestock in your garden, and let's say you go all winter, let's say you have a winter garden that just goes straight to covers and residues for the winter, you're not growing anything. Well, when you come into spring, you're probably, and you want to be no-till, you're probably going to have to graze things way down, right? So you're not thinking about grazing in a holistic or adaptive management where you don't want to deplete the above ground biomass. You actually, that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to graze it way down and hard. So you have those opportunities to do that. And I think sheep and hogs can come in and really root something up. So if you got hogs, you can do that. And then almost have when you're looking at it, almost looks like a clean tilled bed.
Right.
So, I mean, you do need to be careful. You need to be cognizant, and you don't want to run livestock when it's too wet. You can cause a lot of compaction, a lot of issues. Then where all of a sudden you're thinking about using the rototiller again. Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I would say that's one thing that we probably would deal with if we, would be the compaction issues. So, is mulching really the key then, as far as no-till gardening is concerned? Or is there still some of that just opening up the soil and dropping it into that soil bed, or what has been some of your approaches as far as no-till gardening?
Mulches are big. I think that's the key. We're trying to create as much residues as we can, and a diversity of residue, from not very decomposed to very highly decomposed residues. That's the key to the long-term soil management, whether it's in an orchard, in my opinion, anywhere. We're trying to have a continuum and diversity of organic matter decomposition. So the mulches are very important. I mean, even if you need to bring in straw, do not use wood chips. I mean, unless they're very, very well decomposed and broken down, they can add a lot of value and a good fungal component. The compost mulching has become popular. I don't really completely recommend that, but I do know a lot of very successful small market gardeners that are doing that. But we can dive into that more if we want. But it is all about the mulches in many ways, Clay. And even if you're in a tillage system, or you feel you need to incorporate tillage to manage it, and you're trying to do everything you can, you're trying to hit the nail on all the soil health principles, and maybe minimizing soil disturbance is happening, but there's one tillage happening, or one rough disc, which allows you to manage it the way you can. Well, you can come in and put straw down, and if you can grow that straw, or you can, harvest that somewhere and use it from your land, then at least you're closing the loop there, to your question too, some strategies. I mean, I have worked with cereal grains as a no-till mulch, which has been difficult if you don't have a crimper. I've tried some different things, like a ring roller over it. We've even dragged over like a big, heavy steel beam that just crunches it down. There's different, you just go, what equipment do I have out here to do this, and try to mimic something from the big till no-till growers. The thing is, folks need to be very careful with their seed count per square foot on something like cereal rye. That can be a big issue. Any cereal grain, I believe, in the market garden really bring that rate down. And it can be hard for folks to get the rate right because they're not in a calibrated seeder and seeding out to broad acres. So you're usually doing it with, maybe you have like an old seeder on the property, or you're even doing it by hand, or you're doing a push behind. A lot of seeding on market gardens is done with the push behind seeder, like the Jang or the Earthway, and there's some other ones out there. So be cognizant about that, because you're going to get yourself in a management mess if you have this really thick cereal rye, we'll use as an example, and it does tie up nutrients. And I think diversity is important. So you might not get a crimped down vetch or pea as well, but get grasses in there, but make sure it's not too dense, and that will be very helpful, and you'll be happy.
Yeah, and you mentioned composting there, so I'd like to talk a little bit about composting. So tell me about some of the ways that you're thinking about that, and how you've been using it.
Yeah, I believe compost has always been a strong component or tool for building soil health in the vegetable world, and especially the organic vegetables. It's obviously can be quite expensive as a product. If you're buying it, especially nowadays, the cost of hauling is usually more expensive than the compost itself. And then you have to have a way to spread it. And on a small scale, if you don't have a spreader, or you're doing it by hand, or maybe you have a loader bucket and you're staging it, you're getting crafty. If you're skilled with your bucket, like I've driven backwards before and just kind of laid it down, or you can drive forward and do it too, actually. And you're spreading it out by hand a lot of times. So we got to think about that amount of time that we're spending to manage and apply compost, and what are the ultimate benefits of it. I have used it a lot. I mean, I used to work on a farm where we create our own on-farm compost, and even any organic vegetable farm I've ever been on, there's always compost being applied. Absolutely. The way I like to approach is, can we make it on site? Can we find sources in our valley, in our area, feedstock that we believe is good feedstock? Is it coming from an organic source? These are questions we have to ask. If you're buying compost from a large composting outfitter, they often have a diversity of green waste, and there's been a lot of problems around that. Even composting outfitters that advertise their compost as being the best, and it's highly microbial and it's really high in humus, etc. You need to get the most recent compost analysis. A lot of these larger composting outfitters can't get away from sometimes high salts, high potassium. I've seen, very, very high phosphorus loads from compost application. Just nutrient concentrations in general, and metal nutrients that can cause issues, high zinc, copper. Doesn't mean don't use it, but use it judiciously, and understand why you're using it and what kind of benefit you're getting out of the compost. I have worked with the Johnson Sioux. I really like slow static composting. Some of the bigger composting outfitters in California are now required to do the forced air pipes underneath static composting because of air quality, and I think that's producing a higher quality compost from those guys. But looking for opportunities on your land where you can be harvesting material, and even if you have a lot of woodlands and there's trees going down and you need to clean up material, you can be chipping that. And if you have sources of manure, obviously manure and compost is great, but we do have to be careful how much manure. A lot of folks have been on this podcast, I believe, talking about manure management on the land. And those same principles would apply. But, if manure is well composted down, you don't have to worry about it too much. But I also want to say, there's a bit of maybe composting, I don't know if the word would be elitism going on, where you have to have the highest fungally dominated compost or don't apply it at all. I don't quite agree with that, because then we're making everyone become a compost scientist or afraid of using compost. Like I said, there are issues with compost. There can be high nutrient loads. If you're putting 3 inches or 2 inches just top dressing all the time as a compost mulching method, I guarantee you're running into some issues there. There's been research done on farms in California that have shown high nitrate and or phosphorus offloading from some of these smaller garden sites that do a lot of compost. So that can be a disturbance, right? That could be a soil disturbance by applying compost. But the thing about compost, the important thing, right, that we all believe in and is true, is that it is a microbial food source. It generally has a pretty good content of soluble carbon, which is going to feed microbes. This is very important. It's got a great amount of organic nutrients. We know we're adding to our organic nitrogen sources that can begin to be unlocked. And so compost is important. Let's keep applying compost as need be. But to build soil health, do you need compost? I'm going to say no, you do not need compost to build soil health. I think in the smaller setting, we just see it used more because you don't need, it's not as huge of an investment to spread some compost out on an acre market garden. But don't kill your pocketbook to think that you need 15 to 20 tons of compost per acre on a market garden to achieve good natural soil fertility, because you don't. We need to get the cover crops and the rotations, and if you can get some livestock out there. And there's some other, soil amendments out there that we can look at, or augmenting fertility through foliar applications that keep the cost down. And,
yeah, well,
we need to be thinking about the whole toolbox. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Composting isn't one of the 6 principles of soil health. So
no, it's not.
Right. So, I mean, there's, if it was necessary for soil function, it probably would be in the list, but it's not. So it's something that we can do, and it's a great tool in the toolbox, but it's not part of the principles, and I think that's important. Language matters, and the fact that they have labeled these soil health principles means that the principles are the principles because they apply across a broad spectrum of contexts and areas, and then the practices are the things that we adjust on the ground. And I'd say composting is one of those tools in the toolbox of practices that we can employ if we need to.
Yeah, and I would add too, if you have a pretty degraded piece of ground you're working with, it's compacted, it hasn't had good cover. I mean, putting a good amount of compost in there and initially turning it over into the soil is going to be beneficial. It's going to help start rebooting that system and all the benefits you're going to get from compost. But over time, you can be managing more residues through your management and continually building organic matter through your excavates.
Right. And send people to your YouTube channel. Are there other places you'd send them as far as composting, or?
Not really. I mean, I don't really have much of a YouTube channel going on. I've done that as a favor for a few folks. I would like to expand on it. Where would I send people for composting? I mean, I think it's great for people to understand the Johnson Sioux. They don't have to set it up completely like that, but the principles behind a slower static composting. I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I'll tell you where I learned composting was, I have the book somewhere. I think it was written in 1973 or in the 70s from the Rodale Institute. And It still applies. But you can go to like the Rodale Institute and places like that, I believe, to find some information online about creating compost on, if you're trying to create your own compost. But if you're a home gardener or just, moisture is key. And sometimes in some climates, shade's key. So if we're talking about, creating compost, get as much diversity of material you can. I recommend people getting a wood chipper or a garden shredder for material. The more you can shred up material, the better it decomposes. So we can think about that to speed up your, and if let's just go to the home gardener or urban gardener and you've got lawn, use your lawn clippings, throw them in there. When you're pruning trees, wood chip them up. And, just make sure you keep moisture on there, and you can start getting creative with, sometimes people like to throw a little, fish emulsion or hydrolysate in there to add a little nitrogen, speed things up. And I won't go too deep into that, but the next step is really then creating your own compost teas and extracts, which is powerful in the vegetable production.
Yep. Very good. Yeah. Appreciate that. What about pests? In my neighborhood, grasshoppers were a challenge this year. And I think we're kind of in the second year, so hopefully next year they're not. Although all the wives' tales tell us that next year won't be as bad for grasshoppers, given the amount of frogs and everything else we're seeing in the neighborhood, but we'll see if that holds. So anything as far as pests and ways for managing those kinds of things that you've seen be effective?
Yeah, the cliche thing we always preach is diversity, and it is true. And as your soil health is improving and you have the diversity out there, you just don't see pests taking things down. Getting the pollinator species out there is really key, and you can get creative with that. You can even let some of your cash crops flower, like arugula or a brassica. Let it flower; it will attract pollinators. Even legumes, veg, crimson clover. If you have lupins out there, which most people wouldn't plant in their garden, but having intentional insectary plantings, and you can interplant that. I do that through my wider spaced 2-row planted crops, like say peppers and eggplant. And I tend never to just want to have a solid bed of just one variety or even one species of, say, Solanaceae. So I might mix that up in the bed, or have one row of another, and you can seed things down the middle. Cilantro, harvest off of it, let cilantro go to flower. Anything in the umbel family, can't say the whole word of my top, umbellifera, I think is how you say it, family, carrots, dill. So you can get creative, harvest dill and then let it go to flower. Parsley is another great one. So you can use your different herbs out there as well. Let them flower. It does attract predators and parasitoid wasps and something like Queen Anne's lace, which you could also, if you want to, leave some carrots in the ground. And then when spring comes next year, those carrots sprout and they become the most amazing insectary plant. And you'll be blown away. I mean, the noise of insects is incredible. And the other thing, the advantage too of allowing certain crops go to seed or flower and then go to seed, it's let them go to seed, and then you can then collect that seed if you really want to take things to the next level, because it is actually easy to harvest seed, and it's a little overwhelming for people. It seems like this really advanced, like you're getting into plant breeding, and there might be some things that happen, some processes that happen and things don't come out the way you want it. But for some crops like carrots, for instance, you can easily, harvest the seed. So if an intentional design is important, you can then look at putting a row of perennial herbs or other flowering shrubs. So it is really mixing up that diversity in different ways from a perennial planting. And then, if you do have insect issues, or the organic grower, I have a lot of experience with the organic pesticides. I know pesticides are a skull and crossbone word, but we're talking about soft products that have been out there for a long time. There's neem oils that are very effective. There's products that have really advanced their the technology or how they make these products, so they're easy to put through a sprayer. Pyrethrins, spinosad is a product that is very effective. And so if there's organic sprays in the toolbox. The important thing, Clay, is what I preach to people is you need to become sort of an entomologist. Right now we have another career you have to have, but you need to understand the life cycles of these insects. And if there's something in particular that's hitting you every year, you're dealing with flea beetle or aphids, begin understanding their life cycle. And then you can start controlling them better. And if you do need to apply a soft product, then you can do it at the right time, and then that's it. Or when do you cover, like you can deter flea beetle with row cover. So that's a tool. I use row covers a lot. That's a huge tool in the garden, having a row cover to keep insects off, and even other critters that like to just come around and feed off of them. Birds will come down sometimes on a new transplanted bed and take them out, right? So if you're dealing with birds, you're dealing with other critters that are mammals above ground, that's a little more difficult, but there's a lot of things out there. You can get the flying kites, or you can get flashing, what do you call it, the flashing tape or whatever, and that stuff works. And you put it out there and it deters them, but animals are smart and they'll catch on to it and they won't care.
Yeah.
And if you're dealing with deer, then that's a whole different ball game. That'd be a whole nother conversation. But the last point is we really understand that a plant is more susceptible to insect pressure as well when it doesn't have good natural nutrition coming from the soil, and you don't have that good biology. So the more that, a lot of these plants are deficient in micronutrients, or there's an antagonism going on with nutrients in the plant, and maybe there isn't complete protein production in all these in a certain plant, and that's when the insects are able to really get at them. So we don't see a lot of that in a mature, diverse market garden, because most people aren't applying synthetic nitrogen, which would, increase your nitrates in the leaf, which can lead to more disease and pest pressure. And then if you are dealing with, say, mildew, people deal with a lot. Again, there's products out there that you can use in your toolbox. So you say everything's going good, you got all the diversity, but you get high moisture and coolness coming in, and then it spikes and it's warm, and you have a flare up of mildew. There's a potassium bicarbonate is an old school material product that is going to knock it down. So maybe don't be afraid to dip into that toolbox. Some people, they think, well, to be regenerative or even organic, the consumer is amazing. The organic purchasing consumer thinks that it's no spray, when a lot of these organic farms are on a 7 to 10 day spray schedule. But they're, we're talking about large monocropped vegetables, but on the smaller scale, that diversity, it is just by default going to decrease your predation. And, maybe looking at too, if you don't have a good bird population, I'd recommend getting some bird boxes up and just seeing if you can really create that ecosystem. And then don't freak out when something's infesting. Step back and think about it for a moment, because I've had situations where a kale is being covered by aphids, and I'm going, how could this happen to me? Everything's perfect out here. How did they do this? Well, wait a second, Chuck. Everything else on this farm is fine. So maybe that's a sacrifice crop, but we also don't want those aphids getting too out of control.
Right. Yeah. Very good. Chuck, I really appreciate your time today. Any major areas that we missed or anything else you want to cover? I know we just kind of scratched the surface. I think this might be the first time I've used this pun on the Working Cows podcast. We covered a lot of ground today, but anything else that you really think needs to be said before we wrap up? And I hope there's a future episode where we could talk a little bit more in depth about some of these individual subjects, but anything else on your mind?
Yeah, no, maybe a follow-up someday. I love getting into regenerative orcharding and vineyards and the importance of building a strong fungal component in the long-term process of creating a resilient orchard. And, for folks who are interested in orcharding, I recommend they read Michael Phillips' Holistic Orcharding book as a good starting point. And that applies to also vegetables as well. It's a great mindset, and we'll build that knowledge of understanding the role of fungi in the soil, mycorrhizal fungi, both the arbuscular and ectomycorrhizal, and the deep connection of that between plant health and ecosystem health. And maybe that's something we can touch on someday. And I know that maybe I was a bit broad in some way. That's how these podcasts go. But if anyone, there was any little nugget in there and they want more information, then I'd be happy to, chat with them and answer questions. And
Yeah.
I really appreciate you having me on here today.
No, really, I enjoyed it very much, and hoping to apply some of this stuff on our own little piece of garden ground in the near future. Is there soil health academies that focus on these things regularly?
We don't have a soil health academy yet focused on vegetables and fruit, but in fact, I received an email today about it, so it is on our mind, and we are hoping to start developing, more workshops and curriculum around this through our company and through the Soil Health Academy. Absolutely. So we need good host farms to do this. So if anyone's listening, I guess I'll put out a pitch. I don't know if that's okay, but if you think you're well on your journey on this and would love to host a Soil Health Academy or a workshop, I mean, that's something we can talk about, because, when we do these, we don't want it to just be in the classroom. We do want to get out there and look at things.
Yeah. So step one, email Chuck or the Soil Health Academy website and tell them you're interested in a school like this. And then step two, if you are interested in hosting, let them know that too. So maybe we can get one of these going sooner rather than later. So very good. Chuck, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Clay. Much appreciated.
Very good stuff there with Chuck Schembre. Really appreciate his time and taking the time to join me and share some of his experiences and his wisdom with market gardening and gardening in general on the vegetable side of things, and applying soil health principles to that world as well. Looking forward to the next episode of the Working Cows podcast coming your way in just a couple of days as you're listening to this. When it released, we'll be joined on the next episode of the Working Cows podcast by Jeremiah Markway. Jeremiah is from Missouri and has been running sheep for quite a while. They've added sheep into a commercial cow operation, and we're going to talk to him about hair sheep specifically and about what drew him to them, and then how he has been using sheep on his operation and kind of the role that they play there and the importance of them to their overall success of their operation. So looking forward to that episode coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.